The day I inherited a 1,200-acre horse ranch, a woman named Cynthia Harrow drove up in a white sport utility vehicle with a folder of fines already printed and waiting in her hand. She looked at my mud-caked boots the way a person looks at something tracked in on a carpet, and she told me that every day I kept my stallions on that land would cost me $5,000. She believed I would fold within a week, sell the horses, and hand the property to a developer who was already circling. She had no idea the ranch had stood on that hillside a full century before her subdivision existed, and she had even less idea that I had already found the one document that would bring her entire empire down around her. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply nodded, folded the notice into my jacket pocket, and let her believe she had already won. My name is Nolan Rusk, and before any of this happened, I was not a rancher at all. I spent 11 years as a land surveyor and title consultant in the city, reading deeds and easements the way other men read box scores, until the work wore me down and I drove north to clear my head. My uncle Everett Rusk had raised me on that same land for 3 summers when I was a boy, teaching me to read a property line the way some fathers teach their sons to read a fastball. He used to walk the fence with me at dawn, pointing out where the old survey stakes still sat buried in the grass, telling me that a man who understood his boundaries could never truly be pushed off his own land. I did not know, standing at his funeral in a borrowed black tie, how soon I would need every word of that lesson. When he passed, the ranch came to me whole, 36 years old, and suddenly the owner of more land than I had ever imagined managing on my own. I arrived at Red Hollow Ranch, still wearing the same tired jacket I had worn in 100 courtroom hallways back in the city, the collar frayed and the pockets stretched from years of carrying folded surveys, not knowing that habit would be the very thing that saved me. Friends from my old life assumed I had inherited some quiet fortune, a peaceful retreat where I could finally slow down, and for the first few nights I almost believed that myself, lying awake listening to the wind move through pasture grass instead of city traffic. That illusion lasted exactly until the morning a white sport utility vehicle turned in through my gate. The ranch itself was nothing showy. 1,200 acres of open pasture ran up toward the base of the mountains, framed by split-rail fencing that had gone silver with age and a stone stable that had outlasted 3 roofs before Everett's time. No columned gate announced the property, no polished sign caught the morning light, just a weathered board nailed above the entrance reading Red Hollow Ranch in letters my uncle had carved himself decades earlier. Caleb Doss, who had managed the place alongside my uncle for more than 30 years, met me at the gate with a ring of keys, a leather-bound ledger, and a cardboard box of papers Everett had left behind, his handshake as firm as a man half his age. Caleb walked me through the stable that first afternoon, naming every horse the way another man might introduce members of his own family, and I could tell within the hour that he trusted the animals more than he trusted most people who had crossed that threshold in recent years. 14 horses stood in that stable, 3 of them champions in their own right, a bay stallion named Blackthorn, whose bloodline traced back 3 generations of regional titles, a gray gelding called Copper Vale, who had placed at 2 state fairs, and a dark mare named Midnight Anthem, whose breeding contracts alone kept the ranch solvent through lean winters. Caleb explained that Everett had turned down offers to sell parcels of the land more than once over the years, always saying the same thing: that dirt held memory longer than any bank account ever could. I did not fully understand what he meant until Cynthia Harrow's white sport utility vehicle rolled to a stop at the gate less than an hour later. I had barely unpacked my truck when the white sport utility vehicle rolled through the gate, and Cynthia Harrow stepped out asking where the actual heir was, since she did not, in her words, do business with stable hands. When I told her I was Nolan Rusk, she did not apologize. She informed me that Silver Ridge Estates, The gated community that had grown up along my eastern fence line had received complaints about the noise, the smell, and what she called the declining property values my horses represented. She gave me 10 days to sell every animal on the property. I told her, calmly, that the ranch had never belonged to her homeowners association. She smiled, set an envelope on the hood of her car, and told me the fines would begin the following morning, whether I agreed or not. Inside that envelope was a notice demanding $5,000 a day, along with a map claiming Red Hollow Ranch had been formally annexed into Silver Ridge years before I was ever born. A week later, I drove to the Silver Ridge Estates office to ask for the paperwork proving that annexation, and Cynthia made me wait nearly an hour in a hard plastic chair while she sat visible through the glass, doing nothing in particular, occasionally glancing up to make sure I was still sitting exactly where she had left me. The waiting room smelled of fresh paint and expensive coffee, a stack of glossy community newsletters fanned across a side table, each one featuring a photograph of Cynthia at the top of the masthead. When she finally waved me in, she called me Mr. Stableman twice in the same sentence, and her deputy, a nervous man named Todd Mallory, laughed at the sleeves of my jacket as though poverty were something you could smell on a person, glancing at Cynthia after each remark, as if checking whether he had earned her approval. Cynthia's office was decorated with framed renderings of Silver Ridge, as it might look after further expansion, manicured lawns and stone fountains layered over land I recognized instantly as my own pastures, though she never once acknowledged the connection while I sat across from her desk. A brass nameplate on her desk read President, Silver Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, polished to a shine that suggested she'd dusted it herself every morning before anyone else arrived. Cynthia produced a document titled a Supplemental Annexation Agreement, supposedly bearing my uncle's signature, and told me I was to end my breeding operation, stop moving horses along the road nearest the subdivision, remove the Red Hollow sign, and sell every stallion within 30 days. When I asked what authority gave a homeowners association the power to force a private landowner to liquidate his own livestock, she told me that men like me rarely understood how a premium community operated, and she suggested almost kindly that I sell the land itself to a company that had already expressed interest at a price well beneath its worth. I recognized the name on the offer sheet before she finished speaking. It was Blackwood Development Group, and I declined to sign anything that day. As I walked to my truck, a man in a tailored gray suit was studying a folded map of my own property against the hood of a car far more expensive than mine, and something in the way he traced the boundary with his finger told me he already believed the land was his. He introduced himself as Sterling Blackwood, offering a handshake that felt more like a formality than a greeting, and told me, with the polished ease of a man used to being agreed with, that he hoped we would find ourselves on the same side of things before long. I told him I did not yet know what side he was standing on, and he smiled in a way that suggested the question amused him more than it concerned him, folding the map back into his jacket before driving off without another word. The fines began exactly as promised. $5,000 the first day, $15,000 by the third, and by the end of the first week, Cynthia had sent a notice threatening to place a lien against the ranch itself, the total already climbing faster than I had expected even after everything she had told me. Private inspectors hired by the association began appearing along my fence line almost daily, photographing hay trucks, recording the sound of horses in the paddock, measuring fence heights with a tape as though inches mattered, and counting every vehicle that came and went as though tallying evidence for a crime that had not actually occurred. One inspector, a young man clearly uncomfortable with his assignment, admitted quietly one morning that he had been told to document anything that might support a nuisance complaint, whether or not it made any practical sense. I never chased them off. Instead, I wrote down the time of each visit and the license plate of every car, filling a notebook the way Everett had once taught me to document a boundary dispute, page after page of dates and details that meant nothing to anyone yet, but would mean everything later. Cynthia sent an email to every resident of Silver Ridge describing me as an uncooperative landowner and a threat to community safety, language sharp enough that even Caleb raised an eyebrow when I read it aloud to him over coffee. A handful of neighbors began looking at me the way you look at a stray dog that might bite, crossing to the far side of the road when our paths happened to cross near the shared fence line. A small group even came to my gate one evening, polite but clearly rehearsed, asking me to simply sell the horses and end the disruption before it grew into something uglier, and I explained, without heat, that Red Hollow had existed on that hillside decades before their subdivision was ever platted, and that no fine printed on association letterhead could rewrite that history. Cynthia called an emergency meeting of the association and invited me to attend, and in front of several hundred residents packed into the clubhouse, she mocked the idea that a man in a straw cowboy hat believed himself above the law. She stood at the podium describing the ranch as an eyesore that had somehow slipped through the cracks of proper community planning, and several residents nodded along as though she were reciting settled fact rather than opinion dressed up as policy. I asked her, calmly, to read aloud the legal description of the parcel, supposedly annexed into the association, a simple request that any legitimate document should have answered in seconds. She refused, telling the room the details were too technical for someone like me to follow, and a ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd, though I noticed a few faces that did not laugh at all, watching her instead, with the first flickers of doubt. I simply asked the recording secretary to note her refusal in the minutes, and Cynthia's jaw tightened as she realized I was not going to give her the outburst she had clearly been hoping for. She moved quickly to the next agenda item, calling for a vote on stricter enforcement measures against what she termed unauthorized agricultural activity, and the motion passed easily among a room that had heard only her side of the story for weeks. That night, back at the ranch, Caleb told me something I had not known, that Everett had once warned him if the association ever came after the horses, I should look for a red envelope locked inside the old safe in the study, tucked behind a panel, Everett had built with his own hands the same summer he taught me to read a boundary line. Caleb and I found the safe behind a false panel Everett had built into the study wall, its dial stiff from years of disuse, and it took the two of us nearly 20 minutes working from memory and an old combination scrawled in the back of the ledger before the door finally swung open. Inside it was a plat map from 1926, brittle at the folds but still legible. The original lease agreement between Red Hollow and the Homeowners Association, decades of correspondence between Everett and the original developer of Silver Ridge, and a ledger recording easements for the shared road and the well that fed both properties. Caleb sat back on his heels when he saw the plat map, saying he had not known. Everett kept the original anywhere but a bank vault, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, the weight of what we were holding settling over the room like dust disturbed after years of stillness. Laid beside Cynthia's so-called annexation document, the discrepancies were impossible to miss once I started reading them the way I once read contested deeds for a living. The parcel number on her map had been typed in a different font than the rest of the page, a mismatch so obvious I nearly laughed out loud at the carelessness of it. The signature page did not correctly name the legal entity that had actually owned the ranch at the time the document claimed to have been signed. The notary seal belonged to a transaction that had taken place somewhere else entirely, a detail I only caught because I recognized the numbering format from years spent cross-referencing county records. I called Marin Cole that same night, an attorney who specialized in land disputes and who Everett himself had once used for a boundary dispute decades earlier, and after reviewing everything I had scanned and sent her, she called back within the hour, her voice sharper than I expected for so late an hour, confirming the ranch had never been a member of the association in any legal sense whatsoever. Marin cautioned me against revealing everything at once, leaning back in her chair with the particular patience of someone who had watched impatient clients ruin strong cases before. If Cynthia genuinely believed her paperwork was legitimate, she might still be able to shift the blame onto a management company and walk away with only a bruised reputation. And Marin wanted us holding every card before that door closed. But if she knew the documents were false and kept fining me anyway, her exposure would run far deeper. Buried in the old lease was the real prize, an agreement allowing the association to use 12 acres of Red Hollow land for $1 a year, land that now held a portion of the clubhouse, the parking lot, the landscaped entrance garden, and the guard station at the west gate. Article 17 of that lease stated plainly that the token rent would end the moment the association interfered with the ranch's agricultural or livestock operations. Marin told me, with something close to disbelief in her voice, that Cynthia was not simply harassing the wrong man. She was quietly demolishing the very foundation her own clubhouse stood on. I did not strike back immediately. Instead, I sent Cynthia a written request asking her to confirm 3 things in writing: that the association understood the ranch was actively operating as a working farm, that she still intended to demand the horses be sold, and that the fines would continue regardless of any jurisdictional dispute I raised. Believing I was rattled and searching for a way out, she signed and answered every point in full. On the 12th day, the total reached $60,000, and beneath the printed figure she had written, by hand, that I should sell before that number ruined my life. It was around this time that Marin uncovered the real reason behind Cynthia's obsession with my stallions, calling me from the county records office with an edge of excitement in her voice I had not heard from her before. Blackwood Development Group had already filed preliminary plans with the county for a project called Silver Ridge Reserve. 280 luxury homes, a small golf course, a retail promenade, and a Western-style resort hotel, all mapped directly over the footprint of Red Hollow Ranch, as though my fences and pastures were nothing more than temporary inconvenience. Marin said the renderings attached to the filing looked almost identical to the ones hanging framed on Cynthia's office wall, right down to the stone fountain at the entrance. Buried in the filing was a note stating the project was only feasible once the land ceased to be used for commercial livestock. The horses were never about noise or odor at all. They were living proof that the ranch still operated as a working agricultural property, and if I sold them, the land could lose its agricultural tax standing, taxes would climb sharply, rezoning would become far easier, and Blackwood could acquire the property for a fraction of its worth. Evelyn Price, a retired accountant who sat quietly on the association board, reached out to me in secret one evening, calling from a number I did not recognize, and asking to meet somewhere Cynthia would never think to look, a diner 2 towns over where nobody from Silver Ridge ever bothered to eat. She told me Cynthia had met privately with Sterling Blackwood on several occasions, promising the board that selling the ranch would raise every home's resale value, without ever mentioning what she personally stood to gain from the arrangement. Evelyn slid a folder across the table, her hands trembling slightly, and said she had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding whether to bring it to me at all, since crossing Cynthia had never once ended well for anyone on that board. Inside the folder were records from a small consulting firm called Harrow Strategic Advisory, a company owned entirely by Cynthia under a name close enough to her own that no one had ever thought to question it, which stood to collect $250,000 the moment Blackwood closed on the ranch below a set price. Evelyn explained that she had found the invoices while reconciling the association's quarterly books, buried among landscaping receipts and maintenance contracts where she guessed Cynthia assumed no one would ever look closely enough to notice. Cynthia had not simply underestimated me. She had wagered that I was too poor and too uneducated to ever notice the machinery turning behind her finds, confident that a man who mucked out stalls at dawn would never think to trace a paper trail back to its source. Marin wanted to file for an emergency injunction immediately once I showed her what Evelyn had given us. But I told her to wait. I wanted Cynthia to hand us one more confession, in front of the entire board, before we moved, because a woman that's certain of her own power rarely stopped talking long enough to protect herself. By the 24th day, the fines totaled $120,000, and Cynthia sent formal notice that she intended to place a lien against the ranch. She had signs posted near my own gate reading property under HOA enforcement, and I removed every one of them on my side of the property line while recording the entire process on my phone. She called personally to threaten that her private security would block any trailer trying to move horses off the property, and I asked her to put that threat in writing, which she did without hesitation, still convinced I was crumbling. Sterling Blackwood offered to buy the ranch outright for roughly a third of its actual value, telling me in his smooth, unhurried voice that between the fines and the rising taxes, I would soon have nothing left worth keeping. I pretended to waver, asking for 7 more days to consider, and Cynthia, certain I was about to surrender, scheduled a special session for the board to approve a lien, hire a collection firm, and formally ban horse trailers from the community road. I asked to speak at that meeting, and she agreed at once, eager for the chance to humiliate me publicly one final time. During that same week, Marin quietly sent formal notice that the association had violated Article 17 of the lease, giving them 10 days to cease their interference, and Cynthia, without reading it closely, dismissed it as an empty threat from a desperate man. At the community gate one afternoon, she looked at my old truck and told me that once I sold the land, perhaps I could finally afford a vehicle that did not smell like a stable. I told her I hoped she still enjoyed her clubhouse after the meeting to come, and for the first time her smile faltered, though she still had no idea what those words truly meant. Not long after, Cynthia hired a private security firm to block the shared road connecting the ranch to the main highway, orange barrels and a folding gate appearing overnight where no gate had ever stood before. A trailer carrying 2 stallions bound for a breeding contract arrived early that morning to find the road barricaded, the driver calling me in a panic from his cab, unsure whether to turn around or wait it out. Missing that transport would have breached a contract worth far more than the fines themselves. A deal I had spent weeks negotiating with a stud farm 2 counties over, but I did not confront the guards directly. I called the county sheriff instead, brought the recorded easement maps, proving the road was never the association's to control, and stood calmly at the barricade filming every guard who refused to move while the trailer idled behind me. When deputies arrived 20 minutes later and ordered the barricade removed, Cynthia appeared in person, still in her bathrobe beneath a hastily thrown-on coat, pointed at me in front of the gathering crowd of residents drawn out by the commotion, and announced that I was exploiting legal technicalities because I lacked the means to live properly in a civilized community. The lead deputy, a patient man who had clearly dealt with Silver Ridge before, asked her directly what authority the association held over a county-maintained easement, and she had no answer beyond repeating that the road ran through property she considered hers to manage. I asked her one final, simple question, standing close enough that the deputy's dashcam caught every word, whether the association was formally requiring me to end my livestock operation, and she answered without hesitation that she would keep fining me until not one breeding stallion remained on that land. It was the confession Marin had been waiting for, clear proof of deliberate interference with a working agricultural operation. And with the notice period for Article 17 already expired, the token rent on the 12 leased acres converted immediately from $1 a year to fair market value, which an independent appraiser set at roughly $48,000 a month for the clubhouse grounds and parking lot alone. When I mailed the first invoice to the association, Cynthia tore it apart in front of Todd Mallory and called it a stable hand's cheap trick. But Todd had already noticed the property address on that invoice matched the clubhouse where he was standing. The night before the next scheduled meeting, Evelyn sent me the original construction drawings for the clubhouse, and the property line ran directly through the very room where Cynthia always sat at the head of the table. The clubhouse was packed the evening she displayed the fine total on a projector screen, $185,000 after 37 days, presenting me to the room as a cautionary tale about defying the association. She had arranged the chairs in tight rows facing the podium, a set design meant to make the moment feel like a trial with a verdict already decided, and I noticed she had even printed handouts, summarizing the fines for residents to follow along as she spoke. Todd moved to authorize a lawsuit and asset seizure, reading from notes clearly written by Cynthia herself, and several board members nodded before he had even finished the motion. Cynthia invited me forward with a small, satisfied smile, clearly expecting one more public humiliation to close out weeks of what she considered a battle already won. Instead, I asked 3 quiet questions. The date Red Hollow had supposedly joined the association, the name of the person who had signed on the landowner's behalf, and the page containing the parcel's legal description. When she produced the annexation file, Marin enlarged the signature page on the same screen Cynthia had used moments before, and the room watched as the inconsistencies became impossible to deny. A signature pieced together from an unrelated document, a notary seal issued 2 years after the paper claimed to have been signed, and a parcel number belonging to land nearly 5 miles away. Cynthia tried to blame the management company, but I produced Marin's written warning from 3 weeks earlier, proving she had known about the discrepancies and chosen to keep fining me regardless. Then I placed the original lease on the screen, and Marin read Article 17 aloud, explaining that the association had for years been sitting rent-free on land it never truly controlled, and that I sought no eviction, only fair rent and the damages already accruing under contract. Before Cynthia could recover, Evelyn stood and revealed the consulting agreement between Harrow Strategic Advisory and Blackwood Development Group, and the room understood at once that Cynthia had spent their dues chasing a $250,000 payday for herself. Sterling Blackwood rose from his seat near the back and walked out without a word, pausing only to tell Cynthia that their arrangement depended on her controlling the situation, and that she had clearly never controlled anything at all. Cynthia refused to resign, insisting instead that I had stolen internal documents and threatened residents, and the association filed for an emergency order attempting to block my new rent claim, validate the fines, and force a halt to all breeding operations at the ranch. She spent from the association's reserve fund to retain an expensive law firm, which enraged residents already bracing for higher dues, and Todd quietly began erasing his own name from earlier votes he had supported. Evelyn produced meeting minutes showing Cynthia had personally approved expenditures no one else had authorized, while Blackwood publicly withdrew its offer and denied any knowledge of the association's tactics, even though Sterling's own emails proved he had understood exactly what stripping the land of its agricultural status would accomplish. The pressure on my end was real. Breeding contracts grew uncertain as buyers grew wary of the lingering headlines. The ranch's reputation took hits from Cynthia's earlier emails that still circulated among residents, and legal costs climbed by the week faster than I liked to add up at night. There were evenings I sat at Everett's old desk running numbers until well past midnight, wondering whether I had misjudged how long this fight might actually take to resolve. Caleb asked once, gently, setting down his coffee and choosing his words with unusual care, whether selling a few horses might ease the tension and buy us some breathing room while the lawsuits worked themselves out. I told him no, watching Blackthorn pace the paddock fence in the fading evening light, because the moment I sold a single animal under pressure, I would be proving Cynthia's bullying had worked, and I was not willing to hand her that victory, no matter how the numbers looked on paper. Marin prepared a countersuit alleging interference with business relationships, fraudulent misrepresentation, trespass on ownership rights, breach of the lease, and abuse of association authority, and asked the court to order Cynthia to preserve every email and phone record she had before any of it could conveniently disappear. She warned me the discovery process alone could take weeks, sifting through calendars, message threads, and financial statements that Cynthia's attorneys would fight to keep sealed at every turn. I spent several long evenings at Marin's office going through boxes of printed records myself, cross-referencing dates against the notices I had received, building a timeline no jury would need much help following. Buried in that evidence was a message Cynthia had sent Sterling weeks earlier, stating plainly that a man like me would sell the moment I saw a fine reach 6 figures, a line that Marin read aloud twice just to make sure I had heard it correctly the first time. Sterling's own reply was nearly as damning, a short note agreeing that the fines were, in his words, an elegant way to solve a zoning problem without ever mentioning the ranch by name, and Marin flagged it immediately as evidence of coordinated intent rather than coincidence. She printed both messages side by side and set them on the table between us, tapping the page twice as if to make certain I understood exactly what we were holding, a paper trail connecting the fines directly to a development deal neither of them had ever intended a court to see. I remember sitting in that office late one night, watching the pieces settle into place on paper the way I once watched contested boundaries resolve themselves under a magnifying glass, and feeling, for the first time since Cynthia's white sport utility vehicle first rolled through my gate, something close to certainty instead of dread. The hearing was held before Judge Lenora Briggs, a woman known throughout the county for patience with evidence and none whatsoever for theater, and the courtroom that morning was fuller than I expected, word of the dispute having traveled well beyond Silver Ridge by then. Marin arrived early, laying out 3 neat stacks of documents on our table with the calm precision of someone who had done this 100 times before, though she admitted quietly that she had never seen a case with quite so many layers stacked one atop another. The association's attorney argued that Red Hollow benefited indirectly from Silver Ridge's roads and rising property values, suggesting that shared infrastructure implied shared obligation, and Marin answered simply that indirect benefit had never created membership or ownership rights under any statute either of them could name. The court reviewed the original deed, the 1926 plat map, the fraudulent annexation file, Marin's earlier written warnings, the dashcam video of Cynthia vowing to fine me until every stallion was gone, and the secret consulting agreement with Blackwood, each piece entered into the record while Cynthia sat rigid beside her attorney, her composure fraying visibly with every new exhibit. When the judge asked what authority permitted a homeowners association to compel a private citizen to liquidate personal property, Cynthia tried to speak about odor and community standards, and the judge cut her off, reminding the room that the subdivision had been built beside a working ranch that predated it by generations. Cynthia insisted I was merely exploiting a technicality for profit, and when I was asked to speak, I said plainly that I had never wanted the clubhouse or wished harm on any resident, only for the association to stop pretending it owned land that was never theirs. The judge took a long moment before reading her ruling, flipping back through several pages of notes while the courtroom sat in near total silence. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the flat, unhurried certainty of someone who had already made up her mind well before the closing arguments concluded. She ruled that Red Hollow Ranch had never been part of the Homeowners Association, voided the entire $185,000 in fines as though they had never been assessed at all, barred the association from further interference with the ranch's operations under threat of contempt, ordered them to cover my reasonable legal costs in full, confirmed the lease would now proceed at fair market value going forward, and referred the falsified annexation documents to the appropriate authorities for further review. Cynthia's attorney sat motionless through the entire reading, and I watched her knuckles whiten around the pen she had been holding since the hearing began. As the association's own attorney turned to Cynthia with a look that offered no comfort at all, the judge looked directly at her and said that arrogance could not be converted into ownership simply by mailing an invoice every morning. The board called an emergency vote within days of the ruling. The same clubhouse room now half empty of the confidence that had filled it weeks earlier, and even as Cynthia insisted she had only ever been protecting home values, Evelyn read the full accounting aloud in a steady, unhurried voice that carried more weight than any shouting could have managed. She listed the legal fees mounting by the week, the sudden rent obligation now owed at fair market value, the damages owed to the ranch for months of interference, the cost of investigating the falsified records, and the unauthorized payments Cynthia had approved for herself without a single vote from the rest of the board. Residents who had once nodded along with Cynthia's speeches now sat with their arms crossed, doing quiet arithmetic on what all of this was about to cost their own household dues. Todd voted against her without hesitation to save his own position, standing to add, somewhat too eagerly, that he had always harbored private doubts about her methods, and the board removed her by an overwhelming margin that left no room for appeal. Blackwood Development Group severed all contact within the week, a terse letter arriving at the association office denying any wrongdoing, while quietly withdrawing every filing tied to the Silver Ridge Reserve project. The association's insurer refused to cover losses tied to deliberate misconduct and an obvious conflict of interest, citing the very emails Marin had entered into evidence, leaving Cynthia facing a separate lawsuit from her own former board to recover the funds she had misused over the better part of 2 years. She walked out of the clubhouse in silence, and as she passed me, she muttered that the ranch would fail eventually anyway. I told her that it might, someday, but if it did, it would not be because she had handed me a forged piece of paper. The new board reached out soon after, and I agreed to let the association keep using the clubhouse grounds. Provided the rent stayed fair, a sound barrier went up along the shared fence, no one interfered with ranch operations again, and a portion of the settlement went toward repairing the road we all still shared. The negotiations themselves took several weeks, conducted mostly across a conference table in Marin's office, rather than the clubhouse where so much of this had begun, the new board arriving each time with a genuine willingness to listen that Cynthia had never once shown me. We settled the fair rent figure without much argument, agreed on a timeline for the sound barrier, and worked out language ensuring no future board could quietly reinterpret the lease the way Cynthia had tried to rewrite my history with a forged signature. In time, the residents came to understand that I had never wanted to tear their community apart, that every step I had taken was simply an effort to hold the line my uncle had drawn decades before any of them moved in. The person who had actually put them at risk was the one who had spent years insisting she was protecting them, cashing in on their trust while quietly angling for a payday of her own. Months later, Red Hollow Ranch settled back into its old rhythm. Blackthorn ran the open pasture at sunrise the way he always had. The breeding contracts returned in full, and the old sign reading property under HOA enforcement came down for good, replaced with a plain wooden marker that simply read Red Hollow Ranch, established 1926. Caleb hung the new sign himself one Saturday morning, standing back afterward to look at it, the way a man looks at something he has waited a long time to see finished, and I found myself thinking that Everett would have approved of the plain, unhurried lettering. The new board even invited me to a community gathering that fall, and while we never became close friends, both sides learned to respect the line the deed had drawn between us decades before either of us arrived. Evelyn stopped by the ranch every so often after that, bringing preserves from her garden and asking after the horses by name, and Todd, to his credit, sent a written apology I did not expect and did not need but appreciated all the same. Caleb asked me one evening whether I had ever seriously considered selling, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee cooling between his hands, and I looked out at the horses grazing in the last of the daylight and told him that Everett had not left me 1,200 acres, so I could hand them over to a woman with a stack of fines and a stranger's signature. I put the old lease back into the safe where it belonged, and this time the red envelope sat right on top, exactly where the next person to open that door would find it first. Cynthia believed that $5,000 a day would eventually bring me to my knees, that a man in mud-caked boots could not possibly understand what he owned or what he was owed. Every single invoice she mailed only built the case that would end her career, page by page, until the paper trail she was so certain would crush me became the very thing that buried her instead. In the end, I never sold a single horse, never lost an acre, and never once raised my voice louder than the moment required. She lost her seat, her secret arrangement, and any claim to walk into that clubhouse as though it had ever truly belonged to her, while Red Hollow Ranch stood exactly where it had stood for 100 years, quiet, unmoved, and finally left alone.